Three fake HOA enforcers stormed into 82-year-old Eleanor Ainsworth's home thinking she'd be an easy target. They were acting on a tip from a real HOA member convinced an elderly woman wouldn't stand in their way. But they didn't know Eleanor was the daughter of a WW2 veteran, the widow of a soldier, and the grandmother of a fallen Marine. And her 1945 Colt was still loaded. Just wait until you hear how this confrontation ended and why justice in the end came with quiet strength and a glass display case. When the matte black SUV crept onto the gravel driveway of the weathered farmhouse, its oversized tires crunching like a warning, Eleanor Grace Ainsworth stood motionless at the kitchen window. Her fingers, curled and stiff with arthritis, gently gripped the curtain's edge as she narrowed her gaze. 82 years old and barely 5 feet tall, Eleanor hadn't lost a step when it came to vigilance. Not out here. Not anymore. Not since the hurricane tore through Willow Creek Parish the year before, leaving behind more than just uprooted trees and mangled fences. It left whispers, stories. Rumors that turned into warnings about men in fake uniforms driving unmarked trucks showing up at old folks' homes claiming to be from the Homeowners Association, then vanishing with family heirlooms and wallets full of pension money. Eleanor didn't live in an HOA. She'd made sure of that. Her house was grandfathered in, built by her late husband's hands in 1956 when the stretch of land was nothing but pine and promise. She didn't have dues, rules, or board meetings. What she did have was a long memory and a loaded Colt. 1911. She stepped back from the window, slow but steady, her eyes never leaving the vehicle as it rolled to a stop just beyond the porch. It had a decal on the door, not factory, not legal, just big bold letters, crooked and peeling at the corners, reading HOA Enforcement Division. No HOA she ever knew had an enforcement division. Not with blackout windows and men who didn't wear name tags. Her heart didn't race. It didn't need to. Eleanor had faced more frightening things in her life than a truck and some men playing dress-up. She'd lived through the Bay of Pigs, watched the Twin Towers fall, buried her only son who came home in a flag-draped box. This was just Tuesday. Her hand moved with purpose as she opened the oak cabinet above the stove. Tucked behind an old cookie tin and a folded quilt she hadn't used in years was a wooden box. It was scratched and faded. The latch rusted and temperamental, but it still opened with a familiar creak. Inside, wrapped in an oily rag, lay the Colt military issue, full steel frame, blued finish dulled by decades of care. It wasn't just a gun. It was a legacy. Passed to her by her father who'd carried it ashore at Normandy in 1944 and brought it home in 1945. Still warm with the weight of history. He gave it to her on the day she married Arthur Ainsworth with a firm handshake and just 4 words. You'll know when. Eleanor hadn't fired it in over 30 years, but she cleaned it every other Sunday, same as always. Ammunition was kept dry and cool in the cellar next to her canning jars. And now, as the shadow of the SUV stretched across her front porch, that Colt rested comfortably in her palm. Solid, certain, and very much loaded. The grip fit her hand like it had been waiting. Her knuckles whitened around it, not from fear, but from memory. She didn't believe in threats. She believed in preparation. The screen door creaked behind her as she walked toward the front hallway. Each step deliberate, quiet, measured. From the window, she caught a glimpse of movement. 3 silhouettes, all broad-shouldered, one adjusting something on his hip. No uniforms, no badges, just cargo pants, cheap tactical vests, and the kind of arrogance that comes from thinking nobody will stand in your way. Eleanor had seen that kind of swagger before. It never ended well. The house was silent save for the tick of the antique clock in the living room and the soft metallic click as she chambered around. She wasn't looking for a fight, but if they wanted one, they were about to learn that this house, this woman, wasn't what they expected. The curtain shifted as the wind picked up, but Eleanor stayed in position, her eyes sharp, her breath steady. The war might have ended before she was old enough to serve, but she grew up in the shadow of discipline, respect, boundaries. And today, someone was about to cross one. The SUV's doors opened in sync, like a rehearsed routine. 3 men stepped out, moving with the kind of confidence that wasn't earned but borrowed, worn like a costume. Each of them wore a tactical vest, the kind you'd expect to see in a training exercise or a weekend militia game, not in a residential driveway. But what stood out most wasn't what they wore. It was what they didn't. No name tags, no department insignias, no credentials, just blank patches and mirrored sunglasses. They didn't knock politely. The first one, tall, wiry with a sleeve of tattoos running down one arm, balled his fist and slammed it against the wooden front door with a force meant to intimidate. The sound echoed through the quiet yard like a warning shot. The second man, shorter but stockier, broke off and started walking toward the side of the house, eyes fixed on the detached shed near the vegetable garden. He moved casually but with purpose, as if he had a right to be there, as if this was routine. The third, clearly the leader, was broader than the others, with a square jaw and a smirk that didn't belong on a stranger's face. He stepped forward and raised his voice loud enough for the entire block to hear. "We've received a complaint," he shouted. "You're in violation of HOA code, yard clutter, unpaid dues, possible ordinance breach." Inside the house, Eleanor Grace Ainsworth didn't flinch. She stood behind the door, her frame still and upright, Colt gripped low and steady at her side. Her pulse didn't race. Not because she wasn't aware of the danger, but because she was fully. These weren't city officials. They weren't from the HOA. They weren't from anywhere that had any legal right to cross her threshold. Her home had stood on this land since 1956, long before any association came to be. Long before the manicured lawns and mailbox inspections and power-hungry committees that came. With them, she and her late husband had laid the foundation with their own hands, board by board, inch by inch. No board meeting had jurisdiction here. No dues, no votes, no oversight. And every neighbor on the street knew it. "You have no right to be here," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying the same steel as the frame in her hand. She didn't open the door. She didn't need to. She wanted them to hear her, not see her. Let them wonder. Let them hesitate. But hesitation wasn't on their schedule. "Then we'll come in ourselves," the large man snapped, motioning with his hand. With that, the first man took a step back, squared his shoulders, and drove his boot into the base of the front door. The wood shuddered under the impact. The second man, now near the shed, was trying the side window, his gloved hand testing the latch. The leader moved in closer, standing just off to the right of the door frame, staying in the blind spot, clearly trained in more than intimidation. They weren't playing a part. They believed they were in control. This wasn't an inspection. It was a forced entry wrapped in fake authority. But inside the house, Eleanor was ready. Not just with her Colt, but with something more dangerous. Resolve. She had lived through eras that tested the soul, and she had never once surrendered her home, her voice, or her ground. The latch on the door groaned as another kick slammed into the lower panel. The lock splintered just slightly, enough to crack, but not yet break. Eleanor took a single step back, her stance firm, her grip steady. Her breath was even. She didn't speak again. Let them assume she was panicked. Let 836 them make the mistake of thinking she was just an old woman alone, outmatched. Let them believe the myths about age and fear. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing leaves across the porch as the men prepared for their final shove. But the truth was already waiting for them on the other side of the door, in the hands of a woman whose time had come not to flee but to stand. The door gave a sharp, splintering crack as it finally buckled beneath the weight of the intruder's boot. Wood chips scattered across the hallway floor like dry leaves in the wind. Eleanor Grace Ainsworth was already in position, half-shadowed behind the corner of the narrow hallway, her frame steady, her grip firm around the cold steel of the Colt M1911. The pistol, worn smooth by generations of hands, rested naturally in her palm as if it belonged there. Her fingers trembled, not from panic, not from fear, but from the years that had weathered her bones. The tremor was the echo of time, not uncertainty. Her breath was calm, controlled, each inhale drawn with the discipline of someone who had seen too many sunrises to be easily rattled. The man who stepped through the broken threshold was younger, wiry, with a harsh face that bore the weight of arrogance more than experience. A faded baseball cap shadowed his eyes, and the corners of his mouth were curled into something between amusement and condescension. He wasn't expecting resistance, let alone a figure standing like a sentinel in the hallway, weapon drawn. The surprise registered in his posture, a slight pause, a momentary lean back, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but it vanished. Just as quickly, replaced by a smirk that mistook age for weakness. "Take one more step and I'll fire," Eleanor said, her voice steady, each word deliberate. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same clarity she might have used to read from scripture or recite a family recipe. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight behind it spoke louder than volume ever could. But the man didn't take her seriously. Maybe it was the gray in her hair. Maybe it was the way her back curved ever so slightly, or the 1052 gentle tremor in her wrist. Maybe he saw her like most did, an elderly woman in an old house holding on to old things. Harmless. He chuckled under his breath and tilted his head. "You won't even be able to hold that thing steady, Grandma," he said, dismissing her like a child brushing off a warning. And then he stepped forward. The air seemed to still in that instant, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Eleanor's finger, already resting lightly against the trigger, moved with the quiet resolve of someone who understood the cost of hesitation. There was no panic in her motion. No flinch, just precision. Muscle memory and resolve carried her hand forward. The Colt roared, its report sharp and commanding, echoing off the plastered walls like a declaration. The weight of history surged through her palm, her father's grip, her husband's instructions, the stories of sacrifice etched into every curve of the weapon. It was not an act of aggression. It was defense, a line drawn, a truth made unmistakably clear. The man stumbled, shock overtaking his expression, not from the force itself, but from the sheer disbelief that she'd actually followed through. He hadn't seen her strength until it was too late. And Eleanor stood unmoved, her stance still tight, the barrel still steady, eyes locked forward with the same unwavering focus she'd had from the moment they arrived. She hadn't asked for this confrontation, but she was never going to shy away from it. Her home was not a place for shadows to linger or fear to take root. Not now, not ever, and certainly not while she still had breath in her lungs and steel in her hands. The sound of the gunshot tore through the house like a lightning strike, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. It echoed down the hallway, bounced off the walls, and shattered the illusion of control that the intruders had carried in with them. The man who'd crossed the threshold clutched at his leg and collapsed to the floor, his voice catching in his throat as shock set in. The moment that followed was pure chaos. One of his partners stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the porch as he turned to run. A handheld radio flying from his vest and skittering across the floor. The other, panicked and breathless, didn't try to hide his fear as he shouted toward the street. "She's armed. Old lady's got a weapon. We need to go now." But escape wasn't in the cards. Just 2 houses down, Thomas Ashton was watching the whole thing unfold from his front room. He'd been sipping coffee and scanning the feed from the security camera mounted on his front porch. An old habit from his years in the Marines that had never quite gone away. He saw the black SUV, the men in fake gear, the aggressive stance, and then he heard the gunshot through the open window, not just on his camera's mic, but in real time, loud and unmistakable. He didn't hesitate. He placed his coffee on the table, stood up, and reached for the shotgun mounted behind the entryway cabinet. It was clean, oiled, and ready. Not for hunting, not for show, but for the kind of moment you never want to see coming. He grabbed his phone with his free hand and dialed the sheriff. "This is Ashton on Sycamore and 3rd. We've got a break-in in progress." Homeowner returned fire. "I'm stepping out now." By the time the fake officers stumbled back down the steps of Eleanor Ainsworth's front porch, hearts racing and minds spinning, they were already too late. The side gate swung open, and Thomas stepped into view, calm and solid like a boulder in a flash flood. The late afternoon sun hit the steel barrel of his shotgun just right, throwing a glint of light across the driveway. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He just raised the weapon, leveled it with purpose, and gave a command that didn't leave room for argument. On the ground now, he said flatly, eyes locked on the nearest man. "Don't twitch. Don't blink. This isn't the day you want to be remembered for." The two remaining intruders froze. One dropped to his knees, hands up, eyes darting toward the road like salvation might come from somewhere else. The other hesitated, but only for a breath, then followed. Eleanor remained inside, watching from the hallway, Colt still in hand but no longer raised. She didn't have to finish it. The neighborhood had stepped in, and Thomas, stoic, steady Thomas, wasn't about to let anyone turn their street into a playground for intimidation. "You boys picked the wrong street," Thomas added, his voice low, almost conversational. "Too many veterans, too many watchful eyes, and way too many folks who know exactly what freedom means." In the distance, the sound of sirens began to rise, a steady, approaching chorus. For the men on the ground, it was a countdown. For Eleanor and Thomas, it was confirmation. The cavalry was coming, but justice had already knocked first. The sirens pierced the quiet street with growing intensity, drawing closer with each passing second. When the first cruiser turned onto the block, blue and red lights cutting through the late afternoon haze, it wasn't met with confusion, it was met with clarity. The scene in front of Eleanor Grace Ainsworth's house spoke volumes before a single officer stepped out. The three imposters were already face down in the dirt, their arms pinned behind their backs, the false bravado they carried earlier now completely gone. Thomas Ashton stood nearby, shotgun lowered but not forgotten, his stance firm and his eyes still watchful. Eleanor remained inside, seated now, her Colt placed carefully on the table beside her, unloaded, safe, but no less present. As officers swarmed the property, their training kicking in with practiced urgency, one of the younger intruders, the smallest of the three, began to unravel. His chest heaved, not from pain, but from panic. Dirt clung to the side of his face where he'd hit the ground, and tears had already carved streaks down his cheeks. "We didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered, voice cracking. "We were just told to come here. Someone said there was valuable stuff that we could take it legally, said it was abandoned property under HOA rights." The officers didn't respond. Not yet. They moved with steady professionalism, securing the area, documenting the scene. But even as protocol guided their hands, curiosity flickered in their eyes. Who would tell three strangers to pose as enforcement?